Hey everybody, Nathan Brown here with FCB Euro, and today I'm here to talk about the first generation Porsche Cayenne. Porsche didn't really make it easy for us here. They introduced quite a few changes over the years that they sold the first generation Cayenne. So today we're going to go over the different trim packages, options, engines, and some of the common features that the first generation Cayenne has. Before we start actually talking about the details, it's important to kind of talk about the Cayenne and what it really means to Porsche. It was highly unusual at the time. You have to realize that back then in the early 2000s, Porsche didn't sell SUVs. There wasn't already a Macan or any of these other vehicles like the Panamera that you think of when you think of a modern Porsche. So they sold a 911 and they sold a Boxster. And Porsche, being very forward thinking, understood that sports car sales are cyclical and nobody really knows what the future is going to bring. So, not everybody can use a two-seater sports car. They needed a bread and butter product, and the Cayenne was that product. The Porsche Cayenne is built on the same platform as the Volkswagen Touareg and the Audi Q7. And that is the Volkswagen PL71. Porsche being Porsche, they didn't just slap a Porsche badge on the same car and call it good. They have their own internal designation for that chassis, which is the 9PA, and they have completely different engines, electronics, and very importantly, suspension tuning compared to the Q7 and the Touareg. So at the time, hardcore Porsche fans and fanatics really kind of called this the death of Porsche. The world was definitely over. Porsche was going to make and sell an SUV, and the sky was falling. This was made worse by the fact that the rumor at the time is that Porsche actually canceled their high-profile LMP1 Le Mans project to take those engineers and that budget to design and build the Cayenne. While short term that was certainly kind of a bummer for racing fans, I think long term it made a big difference because it essentially made the company profitable to the extent that they can build those fancy cars and participate in high-level racing today. So once the Cayenne was released, it was a hit. It got really favorable reviews among all the car magazines. It was a completely new product. There was nothing else on the market that was as good as the Cayenne at so many different things. It could tow a lot of weight. It was extraordinarily good on-road. It was also extraordinarily good off-road. There was no area that the Cayenne kind of didn't excel, and that was new. It was just a new product. There was nothing that could touch it. So in its very first year, the Cayenne sold 13,000 units in the US, and that may not sound like a lot, but you have to realize that Porsche was a much smaller, very different company then than it is today. That was twice as many vehicles as the 911 and the Boxster. So it really kind of started them on their way to becoming the powerhouse they are. Porsche sold the first generation Cayenne from 2003 to 2010, and over that time period they sold over 95,000 Cayennes. There's quite a few out there, and they're really coming into a sweet spot in terms of what you can get for the money. And so that's why we're really talking about the Cayenne today. There's a ton on the market, and you probably have seen some for sale that you think are remarkably cheap and maybe would be a good buy. Now there is a lot to learn about the Cayenne, there's a lot to know. Some good, some bad. There were other luxury SUVs at the time that Porsche was intending to compete with, such as the BMW X5, the Lexus LX 470, obviously the Mercedes-Benz M-Class and the AMG version of that, as well as the Cadillac Escalade and anything else that was kind of borderline as a luxury SUV. So the 955 Cayenne, it was sold from 2003 to 2006. The first version was the Cayenne S in 2003 along with the turbo. And in 2004 they added the base model, and in 2006 they added the Cayenne Turbo S. In 2008 they introduced the 957, that is the facelifted Cayenne, same chassis, different look, different engine packages. They stayed with all of the variants the entire production period. So there's the Cayenne Base, the Cayenne S, Cayenne GTS, Cayenne Turbo, and Cayenne Turbo S. There is also a rare Transsyberia model, that's the Cayenne S Transsyberia, introduced in 2010. Super rare, only 600 made. So outside of those models, what's the difference between the 955 and the 957? Basically, the 955 is a port injection engine, the 957 is direct injection and has a facelift. All generation Cayennes have an optional air suspension with the exception of the turbo, where it's standard. Now the air suspensions are self-leveling and self-adjusting, so they are pretty trick and do a remarkable job of taking the Cayenne, which is a really heavy vehicle, around 5,000 pounds, and making it quite adept at on-road handling. The air suspension is pretty reliable for the most part. The air pumps can go out, but you don't see a ton of failures on these like you do see on some Audi models, like an Audi Allroad, for example. So because there are so many variations of the first generation Cayenne, the easiest way to break this down is to go back to the beginning, and we're going to go through model by model and go over each individual option in terms of what engine it has and the different drivetrain and option packages. So the Cayenne S, sold from 2003 to 2006, has a 4.5 liter V8 engine that makes 335 horsepower and 310 pound-feet of torque. It is aluminum block and aluminum heads, and is actually a really, really trick motor. You remember I mentioned the Porsche LMP1 program and racing engineers. Well, this engine is actually a pretty decent motor when it comes to like a racing or a high-performance engine. It is a dry sump engine, which means it doesn't have an oil pan, which is ideal for high performance, but it's also ideal for off-road. So if you're driving on really rough terrain or going up or down really steep hills, the engine always has a supply of oil. And that's one of the little touches that the Cayenne has that you don't really think of, but the Porsche engineers certainly did. And it's one of those details that shows how far Porsche went to make sure the Cayenne was as good as it is. The first generation Cayenne S comes with a 6-speed automatic Tiptronic transmission. It's the same transmission shared by the Audi Q7 and the Volkswagen Touareg. It's generally pretty reliable, but you do need to make sure it's maintained properly. If it's shifting hard or slipping or anything like that, that's an obvious indication that the transmission has not been cared for. So the brakes on Cayenne models are all pretty similar. There are some differences, but they all feature 6-piston front calipers and 4-piston rear calipers. The Cayenne S has 350mm front discs and 330mm rear. The 4.5 liter V8 in the Cayenne S is pretty reliable for the most part, but you do need to make sure it's been properly cared for. Being that it is an aluminum block, it does have a Locasil coated cylinder walls, and if the car doesn't see the oil changes that it should get, you can see some wear there. That's a major problem, and if you ever look at a Cayenne that has a large amount of knocking at idle or something like that, that's one to stay away from because it probably needs an engine. Now, they can last quite a long time provided that they're cared for. It's just something to watch out for. So the 955 Cayenne S is probably going to be the most common one that you will find for sale, and the pricing really varies quite a bit. You can find them as low as $3,500 for one that probably needs a bit of work, and as high as $12,000 for a lower mileage cream puff. So moving on to the Cayenne Turbo, that also shares the same 4.5 liter V8, but with the addition of the turbos, it makes a lot more power. That makes 444 horsepower and 457 pounds-feet of torque. Also comes with a 6-speed transmission, and the turbo came standard with an air suspension. The towing capacity on the Cayenne Turbo, the same as all other Cayennes sold in that time period, is a little over 7,700 pounds. So it's a great tow vehicle potentially for a race car, boat, almost anything you can think of. Contrary to what you might think, the Turbo Cayenne is actually known to be a little bit more reliable than the Cayenne S. There are some common problems that they both share, but we're going to get into those details a little bit later on. So the Cayenne Turbo is not quite as common as the Cayenne S, and they do generally cost a little bit more money. You'll generally find them from around $7,000 up to the mid-teens, really depending again on the condition and the mileage of the vehicle. Somewhat confusingly, Porsche introduced the base model Cayenne in 2004, a full year after they introduced the Cayenne S and the Cayenne Turbo. It's a little bit of an afterthought if you think about it that way. It is the only Cayenne that doesn't feature a Porsche-specific, Porsche-designed engine. It uses a 3.2 liter VR6 engine that it borrowed from Volkswagen, and it makes 247 horsepower and 229 pound-feet of torque. When you think about it, that's about half of what the Turbo makes, which is pretty crazy on a 5,000-pound truck. But according to those who do own these, they are still pretty good for towing and still a pretty good value. Arguably, the VR6 is one of the lowest maintenance engines that Volkswagen has produced. So the base model Cayenne also comes with a 6-speed automatic Tiptronic transmission, the same as the S and the Turbo, but it also introduced the option of a manual. They are fairly rare, but you can find them for sale, and it is definitely going to be a lower maintenance option. The Cayenne base with the manual transmission is not super common, but we actually do have one here with us today behind my right shoulder, and we're going to check that out a little bit later on. The Cayenne base model comes in around the same pricing as the Cayenne S, somewhere around $3,000 to $4,000 for one that needs some work, and maxes out somewhere around $8,000 or $9,000. It is, in my opinion, probably one of the more hidden gems in the Cayenne model lineup, just from a maintenance and reliability standpoint. So the last version of the first generation 955 Cayenne that we're going to talk about is the Cayenne Turbo S. That was introduced in 2006 and only sold in that 1 year. The Cayenne Turbo S makes 514 horsepower and 531 pounds-feet of torque, which is pretty bonkers for an SUV. 0 to 60 times under 5 seconds, and it has over 160 mile-an-hour top speed. The Turbo S is essentially a slightly more powerful, more fancy version of a turbo, but it's not really fundamentally all that different. It has all the same options and the same features, the same 4.5-liter engine, same transmission, same air suspension, and everything else. Obviously, they did not sell very many Turbo S models, being that it's only 1 year, and pricing reflects that. So you're gonna see somewhere around probably $11,000 to $20,000, depending on the condition and the years. So all the first generation Cayennes look pretty similar. There are some differences in terms of the front bumper, the wheels, and the badging, but from the base model all the way up to the Turbo S, there's not a lot of variation. All that changed with the 957. The 957 is essentially a facelift, but it also incorporated quite a few other mechanical changes. All the first generation Cayennes are port injected, while the second generation 957 featured direct injection. Obviously, the 955 has clear Porsche DNA, and I think that that was intentional. They wanted to make sure people knew that this was a Porsche, so they wanted it to look very similar to the 911s and Boxsters that were sold at that time. With the 957, it really started to kind of look more integrated. It had a new front bumper, it has new lights, and so with the 957, the Cayenne really truly became its own model. So as you'll notice, the 955 Cayenne is produced until 2006, and the 957 starts in 2008, so there is a 1-year gap there. Starting with the Cayenne base, it is still VR6 powered, except now it is 3.6 liters, and it is direct injected. So the base model Cayenne makes 286 horsepower and 284 pounds-feet of torque. In terms of a driving experience, allegedly this makes all the difference over the 3.2 liter model in terms of being a little bit more fun around town, but it does not change the towing capacity or anything like that. Pretty much all the other driveline components are the same as the 955. It still features the same ASIN 6-speed transmission and a manual option on the base model. The base 957 Cayenne, being a little newer and being a little more desirable from a visual standpoint, is going to cost a little bit more money. Obviously, it's going to depend on the mileage and the features, but you can expect to pay somewhere around $8,000 to $14,000. So moving on to the Cayenne S, it again features a naturally aspirated V8 engine, this time displacing 4.8 liters and making 380 horsepower and 369 pounds-feet of torque. The engine itself is very similar to the 4.5, but it is, of course, now direct injected on the 957 Cayenne S. So outside of the horsepower and the injection change, there are some other differences between this engine and the earlier 955 that addressed some of the smaller problems, such as coolant pipes and things like that. So with it being a little bit newer and a little bit more reliable, you are going to pay a little bit more for a 957 Cayenne S. Pricing will vary, but you can expect to pay somewhere around $8,000 to $15,000 for an example. Somewhat unusually, these are priced remarkably close to the Cayenne base on the 957. Not really quite sure why, but you will generally find both of those models almost interchangeable if that's within your budget. Moving on from the Cayenne S, there was a new for 2008 GTS model. This took that naturally aspirated V8 engine and bumped up the power to 399 horsepower. It still kept the same 369 pound-feet of torque. The GTS is pretty cool because it's probably the most sporty version of the Cayenne that you can find. It has totally different body kit, different wheels, and like the base model, comes with an optional manual transmission. The GTS is a perfect example of Porsche being Porsche. They love special edition models, they love limited edition models, and they love to make sort of like a more GT variant of anything that they make, and that's basically what the GTS is. It may be 10 or 12 years old at this point, but the GTS is arguably one of the more desirable Cayennes that you're going to find, and the price will reflect that. That said, you can still get them for a fairly low price. You know, you can get them for around $13,000 if it's higher mileage or something like that, but you can find them easily topping $30,000 if it's extremely low mileage or a very desirable option package. Jumping from the GTS, we basically get back into the regular Cayennes and we go to the Turbo. With the 957 Turbo, it's pretty much the same story as it was in the 955. You take the same engine out of the Cayenne S, slap some turbos on it, and make a lot more power. Power on the Turbo is up to 493 horsepower and 516 pounds-feet of torque. They make a lot of power out of the box, but you can bump it up to even more with some aftermarket tuning. The pricing is starting to creep up a little bit. This is a very desirable model, obviously, so you're going to pay more money for it. Still relatively inexpensive considering the fact they probably cost so much money new, but you can expect to pay around $15,000 to $22,000 for a 957 Cayenne Turbo. Moving on from the Turbo, we get to the range-topping 957 Turbo S. Once again, 4.8 liters, twin turbocharged, but with more power. This time, 542 horsepower and 553 pounds-feet of torque. The Turbo S really moves. 0 to 60 is in the mid 4-second range, and it is quite a super truck. Comes with the same 6-speed automatic Tiptronic transmission as all the other Cayennes that we've talked about, as well as a standard air suspension. So aside from the increase in power, the 957 generation Turbo S and Turbo models do have an optional bigger brake at 380 millimeters in the front and 355 millimeters in the rear. So the Cayenne Turbo S, being the range-topping model, is going to cost more money than the lower-end versions. Pricing again is going to vary, but you can expect to pay somewhere around $18,000 to $25,000 for one of these cars. It's a little bit of a unicorn, but there is one more Cayenne model to talk about, and that is the Cayenne S Transsyberia. So that is a 2010 only model. It was made to commemorate Porsche's participation in the 2007 Trans-Siberia Rally, and there were 600 sold in the United States. It is essentially an off-road sort of package that they introduced. They combined the higher output engine from the GTS along with some off-road oriented features such as skid plates, bash guards, and things like that. If you happen to see a Trans-Siberia, you will know immediately because it looks kind of like a GT3 RS or an RS version of a Cayenne. It has a base black or silver paint with bright contrasting orange graphics. Now that we've gone over all of the individual models and the different engine options, we're going to get into some of the more general aspects of the Porsche Cayenne. And most of what I'm talking about is going to cover both the 955 and the 957. In terms of the interior, it's all very similar. Obviously, being a Porsche, you have leather seating surfaces and things like that. It's a fairly sporty kind of 911 inspired interior in terms of the steering wheel, but there's not a lot of changes actually from the beginning until the end. As they got a little bit newer, obviously you had maybe some different electronic functions. One of the biggest updates on the 957 is the Porsche Communication Management, which is essentially the infotainment touchscreen interface. That's touchscreen, it's got Bluetooth, it has an iPod connection, it has an auxiliary audio input. It's probably going to be outdated a little bit like anything else that's 10 or 12 years old, but it is considered to be a little bit easier to use and a little bit more desirable. Being an older car, you're obviously going to have to watch for some normal wear and tear on the interior. There are some surfaces and some of the materials will start to come apart a little bit. Nothing that's really major, and you should obviously not find any major degradation of the interior or anything like that, but there are things you're going to have to start to look out for that will need repair as the vehicle ages out. Now that we have a general overview of the interiors and the drivetrains and the engine options, we'll jump into some of the general problems that you may see on a Cayenne. Now, this is not intended to be all-inclusive or go into great depth. We are actually going to come out with a whole range of videos about each of these subsystems, so make sure you check those out if you're thinking about buying a Cayenne or you just want to learn more about it. But briefly, we're going to go over some of the common issues. So first of all, water intrusion into the cabin is fairly common. That can occur from a couple different sources. It might be from clogged rain tray or from a clogged sunroof drain, but it's definitely something to watch out for and can give you some electrical issues. In terms of the engines, on the 4.5 liter V8s, it's very common to have a coolant pipe failure on those. They are plastic from the factory. There is an aluminum updated version. Water pumps are fairly common on all the V8s. The direct injected V8s, you have a potential problem with a high pressure fuel pump, secondary air pumps, things like that. The transmission's generally very reliable, but if it hasn't been serviced, you may have some valve body issues and things like that. So some of the things to look out for on any of the VR6 models would be timing chain service. They don't wear out prematurely, but if the engine is not properly cared for, you may begin to see some issues there. I've seen it as low as 80,000 miles actually on really abused units, but you can also see the 3.2 and 3.6 VR6 at close to 200,000 miles on the original timing chain, so it really comes down to service. On the 3.2, it has a dual plenum intake manifold. There's a little bit of play that can occur there that creates quite a bit of noise, so it might sound like rod knock or a very serious problem. Also on the VR6 is that you will occasionally, again, just as on the V8, see some cooling problems and things like that in terms of leaks, water pumps. I mean, really, when it comes down to a used vehicle, those are all things that are going to fail and you are going to have to replace at some point. Probably the most common problem on the driveline in terms of failures and problems is actually the drive shaft carrier bearing failure or the cardan shaft. some rubber deteriorates and it makes a heck of a lot of noise. Doesn't really hurt anything, but it's definitely something that will happen. The transfer case actuator motor can sometimes get a little bit sticky, especially in cold weather or if it doesn't get used enough. You have a very common failure on the rear hatch shocks on the manual hatch models. Not a real difficult technical replacement, but certainly something that can be a little bit challenging. Universal to pretty much all Cayennes are potential problems with the headlight wires. The headlights in a Cayenne slide into tracks and are locked into place with a little Allen key. It's a very similar design as to what's used on the 911. The problem is when it locks in, it may not be a totally tight connection, and a loose electrical connection means extra resistance, and extra resistance means heat. That means melted wires. Again, there's updates and fixes for these things, but that's something to look out for. In terms of the interior, you have some general leaks and rattles that can occur on the sunroof equipped models. And there are some more common issues on some of the interior components. The seat backs on the earlier Cayennes, the bond that holds the back of the seat can kind of fail and they fall off and you have to kind of repair that. You know, anytime you're looking at a vehicle that's the age of one of these Cayennes, you know, almost getting on 20 years at this point, the care that's gone into the vehicle will be very evident when you're looking at it. You know, leather seating surfaces do need a certain amount of care, whether it's cleaning or re-oiling and things like that. So when you see a Cayenne, if it's got, you know, cracked seats, that's probably not going to be all that surprising, but it may be indicative of the care that it's had. And that actually brings up a really, really good point. And that is the Cayenne attracted a new buyer to Porsche, which was kind of the whole point. They wanted to bring new people into their ecosystem that wouldn't have looked at a Porsche otherwise. You know, there's a lot of people out there that may not know, they may not be interested in a sports car, but they know the prestige of Porsche and they're attracted to the brand because of that. So, you know, somebody that buys an SUV for a daily driver may not necessarily put the same care into it as somebody who saved their whole life or is finally getting that Porsche 911 sports car that they've always wanted since they were a kid. So it is really, really important to do a thorough check on any Cayenne that you're looking to purchase. One of the most important processes of buying any used Porsche is what's called a pre-purchase inspection. You're probably familiar with this and may have had this done with other high-end or expensive cars. But on a Porsche, it's pretty crucial. I usually would recommend that you contact an independent dealer or an independent service center or something like that to get that done. Basically what that's doing is you're getting somebody to check the vehicle over. They're going to use a Porsche scan tool to check all the electrical systems and make sure that there's no hidden issues that you're going to be buying. If you get that back and your Cayenne has a pretty clean bill of health, you can go into the purchase with a little bit more confidence, even if the car has higher mileage or is, you know, 10 or 15 years old. An important thing to keep in mind when you're looking at a used Cayenne is that unlike some other manufacturers, although there's a Cayenne S and there's a Cayenne base and there's a Turbo S, whatever, there's aren't really any trim levels in between there. You know, there's not a Platinum or a Platinum Plus. Each individual Cayenne is going to have a list of options that the owner may have checked some boxes on, but won't necessarily be identical to the next Cayenne. So you may find one that has a tan interior with nice wood grain trim, another one has a black interior, one might have like a silver trim option like the base on over my shoulder here, but there's no real kind of like cut and dry way to box that in terms of things that you're looking for. So the best thing is to kind of keep your eyes open, and if there's a key feature that you really, really want to have, be it a manual transmission or a certain optics package, just keep your eyes open for that. So some of the ways that Porsche really optimized the Cayenne for both on and off-road use include the Porsche Dynamic Chassis Control option, which was available on the 957. These were hydraulically controlled sway bars or anti-roll bars on the chassis that were constantly working to keep the car flat or optimized in whatever situation it was in. So if you're going 130 miles an hour on the Autobahn, the air suspension begins to lower itself, and the sway bars will optimize, you know, for cornering or whatever. Likewise, if you're going off-road, they can actually get to the point that they will completely disconnect and allow for more suspension travel and more articulation. Those sorts of touches combined with a low range on the four-wheel drive really make the Cayenne a good all-arounder and incredibly competent at off-road use. The final kind of piece of the Cayenne story is that although it wasn't designed as a racing Porsche, it actually did go racing and did win at the Daytona 24-hour race. Back then in Grand Am, there was a team that took that engine and developed it independent of Porsche into a racing engine for Daytona prototype. And it was contentious to the point that Porsche did not want their badges on the engine. They didn't want to be associated with it. Eventually, they won the 2010 Daytona 24-hour race overall, and of course, after that, Porsche, owned up to it and decided that it was okay that they had developed this engine for racing. So, even though it was never part of the plan, the Cayenne engine went on to do some great things when it comes to sports cars. So that about wraps it up for this overview of the Porsche Cayenne and some of the common things that you may find. Now, obviously, this is a very general overview. We didn't do a really deep dive on any of the systems or any of the problems that you may see or some of the services you may want to attend to if you own a Cayenne. We are going to do those on some future videos, as I mentioned, so keep your eyes peeled for those, whether you're looking to buy a Cayenne or just want to learn more about it. If you do own a Cayenne now and have some personal experience, or if you have a specific question about one, obviously go ahead, drop it in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button, and of course, if you have not, subscribe to the channel. And with that, we'll see you on the next one.